Hi, everyone. I'm BJ. I'm a genealogist in Maine, and I mostly look at Maine, New England, and Scottish records, but I'm willing to go wherever the tracing ancestors takes us. And tonight we are going to go to Scotland and Ireland. Um, I've been working on my own family a bit and have what I think is an interesting story. And the other thing I've been doing is thinking about how I put together charts to show to you guys. And so this is a good example for me to show you a bit about how thinking about charts can sometimes help you figure out relationships and how to picture something. So let me start the slideshow and now share my screen. Okay. Are you guys seeing my screen? Good. So this woman is my several greats grandmother. Um, she had a rough life. Um, and which I think you can see in her face. And she's actually not the focus of the people we're going to be talking about. She married into the family that I'm going to be talking about. Um, but what I've got here is some stories that connect several families, and they're interesting to me because they're connecting some of the distant DNA matches I'm getting to particular ancestors. And so, and then finding distant DNA matches is helping me find other records that confirm who I'm looking for. So let's take a look. Well, first, these are my grandparents. Um, and it's my grandmother's family we're going to be talking about. They were, this picture is actually taken in 1918, although they didn't marry until 1924. Both of them were born in Scotland. They got married in Canada and died in the US. But as we're going to see, this family did move around some, um, much more than you would think. So, anyhow, this is down here at the bottom on this slide. This is my grandmother um, and my grandfather, and then her parents. And I did this chart this way because we have sort of the main stem of the people that this is focused on in the middle with the purple backgrounds, and then the additional information that isn't necessarily relevant to what I'm going to talk about, but shows that like these weren't only children, um, and that this Elizabeth Little had four children and never married. So that's why I did this chart this way, is that it's following, you know, my grandmother's straight maternal line pretty much, um, as a way to, you know, sort of focus who we'll be talking about. So one day I went into Ancestry, and um, this match number two I've known about for years. We connected back in the days of email lists and not much else for genealogy, you know, like 15 or 18 years ago. But this was in my brother's shared matches, and we end up with match three and match four as well as match two. And originally it was just match two or three. Match four is very recent. We'll get to that later. And what I've done at Ancestry is I've used the little color dots, and this particular color means they're all part of the, we're all related on the Arthur side. My grandmother's maiden name was Arthur. She was Margaret Arthur. Her father was Edward James Arthur. She had a brother, Edward James Arthur. Um, my brother was doomed to be named Edward because there were Edwards on my grandfather's side of the family as well. Um, and then the star means that she's one of the fairly close-ish relatives I'm willing to rely on for matching, shared matching. That if someone matches her, I know that they match me on the Arthur side of the family. But I do that so that the ones that are close enough that I should have a match with, I know who they are. Um, and as you can see, um, Ancestry very nicely tells me that our trees have a common ancestor. So anyway, I see match 3, and I go look at it a bit more. Well, we'll come back to that. So anyway, here's my grandmother's grandmother, Elizabeth Little. She's the one who never marries. Here she is in 1861 with her family. She's still in school. Um, Interestingly, it's 3.5 years later when she's 16 that she has my great grandmother. So she had a very young pregnancy for the time and place. And as you can see, her mother, Margaret Gregg, and Margaret's mother, Margaret Cant, follow the older Scottish custom of not using a married name. They are still using their maiden name in these records. This is changing at this point. You begin to get the English Victorian influence. You start getting women using their husband's name socially, although legally they would still be called Margaret Gregg or Little, or Margaret Cant or Little. Um, so just out of this census, we're able to put together, you have a woman, Margaret Cant, who has a daughter, Margaret Gregg, who married a William Little, and then they've got these children, William, Elizabeth, Margaret, John, Jane, and Robert. So, 6 children. Now, what's interesting, as I said, this is a different way to look at this. And again, this is one where the focus, for me at least, is when I look at this, the focus comes in on this Elizabeth Little. She's got the biggest box, um, and she's not quite in the center of it, but she's close. And this is one of the reasons I've been playing around with using PowerPoint um, for these, is that the reports you get out of either a program like Legacy or Roots Magic or Family Tree Maker, or out of things like Ancestry or Family Search, you don't have the options for changing the focus this way. You know, you either end up with all the children or none of the children in most of the prepared um the parts that the programs do for you. And I'm finding as I read, for example, the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, which I'm in a discussion group with a bunch of other genealogists to do. And almost every month, one of us says, this would have been so much easier to understand if there was a basic pedigree chart like this. But this isn't really a pedigree. It's not just the straight line. It is showing some things off to the side. I didn't put it here, but for example, this Margaret Gregg, I have found one brother for. I haven't found the father's name, but I found a brother. And so I could put him in here if I want, if it was relevant to my topic. But, at this point, we're not going to talk about these other kids. So here's one of the things that's really interesting. So back to this 1861 census, And we have William Little. He's a shepherd, and he's living in parish of Cavers with his family, just right outside the town of Hoyk. And we're down almost into England at this point. Um, and in fact, at one point in a little bit, they actually Elizabeth Little's second daughter, without a husband, is actually born in the first parish you get to when you cross the border into England in East Learmouth. So they're right on the border. But then Margaret Gregg is born in Murrayshire, sometimes called Elginshire. It's up just east of Inverness, in the way to Aberdeen. And I will show you here. So here's a map of Scotland with the traditional counties. And Cambers is down here. And the church where Margaret was baptized is up here. And if you look at this map that shows the land, it's a topographical map. You're going from down here where it's hilly but not really rugged, up through the central belt where it's very urban, and then across these mountains that are quite rugged. And then you get coastal plain again. So one of the big questions I had when I started researching this family was, how on earth did they meet each other? Good question, right? Well, this is pretty much pre-railroad. They were married by the mid 1840s, where there were railroads, but they weren't everywhere yet. Um, it's really the 1850s before you can count on railroads in a lot of places. So turns out, and this is one reason I think this is such an interesting story. I know I'm easily amused, um, but you actually have to go further north to figure out how they met. And this is a census from 1841 from the parish of Galsby in Sutherland, which is this blue star up here. And it's the household of Patrick Seller. And he was an interesting character. If any of you know much about Scottish history, you may actually get the name. So here he is. He's a farmer. He's well established at this point in the 1841. But his earlier life was really interesting because he worked as a factor that's essentially the agricultural overseer or manager for a landowner. And he was actually quite notorious. Earlier, back in the 18 teens, he had been the factor for the Sutherland estate owned by the Duchess of Sutherland. And he was quite enthusiastic about clearing people from the land. Um, Clearing in this sense basically meaning evicting these traditional crofters with their small holdings, where they basically did subsistence farming off the land. And again, if you've read much of UK history, you've probably heard of the Highland Clearances. Patrick Seller was notorious to the point that in 1816, he's actually tried for murder from one of these evictions. And he was acquitted. At that point, he is becomes he's replaced as factor, but he continues on as a farmer. And so what happens is that the reason they wanted to clear the land is that with the growing industrialization, sheep were more profitable for a landowner than renting to subsistence farmers. And so they wanted to clear the land for sheep. Well, the sheep from northern Scotland are smaller, their wool isn't as good, whereas the sheep from southern Scotland, the borders into the northern part of England, they, they were bigger, they had more wool, it was better wool. So it was sheep. And if you drive around a good chunk of Scotland these days, this is what you see. And so Patrick Seller was one of several farmers in the Highlands who bought sheep from southern Scotland to go to northern Scotland, replace the local sheep with the more profitable sheep with more wool per sheep. Um, and so several of these farmers then turned around, and not only did they bring the sheep from southern Scotland, they brought shepherds along who knew how to deal with them. So that is how William Little gets from southern Scotland to Sutherland, which is called Sutherland because to the Vikings, it was south of them, but it's northern Scotland. So that's how they met. And then they did move back down south, I think when his father died. Um, so anyway, here you see them on that 1841 census, not yet married, not, you know, their ages were rounded down to the nearest five. And then this end means they were not born in that county. Um, but that's how they met. And this is not actually the house they lived in, but it's close and it's very similar. It's a very small but pretty area. If you're ever in Scotland, it's worth getting out of the cities. So anyway, Elizabeth Little marries an Edward James Arthur. Well, this is Edward's father. Um, and for a long time, I'd been searching for this guy's origins for 25 years. 4 trips to Scotland, couldn't find a thing. 2 trips to Ireland because, you know, in the census it said he was born in Ireland. Nothing closer than that. Um, I'd made some I'd been able to narrow it down a little based on where the name was. The name Arthur, fortunately, is not Murray or Sullivan or Gallagher. So I'd been able to sort of narrow it down to a particular area. I was about 20 miles off, actually, because I have found where he's from. So let's take a look at how. Well, and this is my other mystery with him. When he dies in 1903 from a little too much New Year's Eve, he was drinking and managed to drown himself in a local brook stream. It says American papers, please copy. Now, what that means is they're expecting American newspapers, when they get this Scottish newspaper, to take this death notice and put it in their paper. Often these do say, New York papers or Baltimore papers, but this one just says American, which probably means that at this point, the family in Scotland knows there's family in North America, but doesn't know where. And the only person I knew in this family who had emigrated to the US wasn't until 20 years after this, when my grandmother, his granddaughter, left Scotland for Canada and then the US in the mid 1920s. But we're going to figure this out with a DNA match. So as I said, that's the thing that had me really intrigued. Here's the articles about him going drinking on New Year's Eve and then finding himself in a creek. Um, Evidently, the family story that match of mine that I'd known through email lists, her family story, which my father had not heard, is that basically this Edward James Arthur, he was a drunk. He was married to that Jane Ketty Arthur I showed you at the front or the beginning of this. And if she was out in town and saw him, she would actually cross the street to not be near him. She was so embarrassed by how much he drank. But, this was not an era where good Christian couples get divorced. So, um, and the pub hotel that he was drinking at still exists. It is still a pub and a hotel. And yes, I have stayed there. It's actually a very nice place, as little town hotels in Scotland go. So anyway, here we go. Again, this is who we're looking at. You get three Edward Arthurs in a row. The only source I have for these names is, his marriage and death certificate. Um, but again, I don't know how much the informant knows. We've got the American Papers, Please copy. But as far as I can tell, none of his kids have gone to the US. So I figure, but how am I going to find somebody? I don't know whether it's a sister, a brother, a cousin that they're looking for, um, born in Ireland and living in the US. And who knows whether in this case the context couldn't mean Canada. Family went to America. Um, well, what happens next is this. Oh, here's a slightly bigger tree. You will want to notice Edward James Arthur named the person the grandfather, and the other son they name the other grandfather. Um, Jane Kitty had a daughter before she married Edward, who ended up living with the grandparents, which is how I found her. But you want to take note that you have Jane had already named her daughter Mary, and Edward's mother was supposedly a Mary, as was Jane's mother. Notice, even though Jane has a Mary, they name a child Maria Ann. Hold that thought, okay? So find this match and don't recognize any of the other matches, but he matches the match number two um, in Australia that I'd known through email. And I look at his tree. And it's funny because I first popped over to his tree and I groaned because I could see it was just a few people. And then I read it and I went, oh, what do you think about that? There's an Eva Maud Arthur. Let's see where this goes. Well, I do some tracking down, and Eva was born in Ireland, and her parents were a John Arthur and a Letitia Glass. So I look into that because, John Arthur. Well, it turns out that John Arthur's death record does indeed say his parents are Edward Arthur and Mary Hood. The same names Edward had on his death certificate and marriage record. And interestingly, um, John and Letitia named their first son George Hood Arthur, and the second one is William Edward Arthur. And those two sons both died and they reused the names. So obviously, there's some family significance. It turns out I'm pretty sure Letitia's father is George. Um, so we have this. And then right around the same time, one of the pay-per-view websites put up some newly digitized records, and I found that Edward Arthur and Mary Hood were indeed married in the parish of Ardstraw, County Tyrone. So getting a little more here. Um, so beginning to get more. Um, and so then I was able to look at the Ardstraw records and discover a baptism for a William Arthur. I haven't found any more records that are decisively him. There's no civil registration in Ireland at this point, and burial records are pretty skimpy. So he may have died as a child. He may have headed for Australia. Haven't found anything more on him yet. Um, but you know, that's how things go. But at least I'm pretty sure now that the Edward Arthur and Mary Hood are the right names for my Edward James Arthur's parents, and that he was probably born somewhere in the western part of County Tyrone, um, or just over the border into Donegal, which is the one record I had for him said he was from Donegal. So there's actually Ardstraw is one parish away. There's one parish between Ardstraw and the border between, and now it's the border between Tyrone and Donegal and between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So I was on the right track, which I'm very happy about. So then I get another DNA match, and it's going to turn out that there's a sister, Maria Ann Arthur. Remember that Edward James and Jane named their daughter Maria Ann? So we have that. And let's see how I found this. This is kind of interesting. Oh, and the other thing is I have two matches that have just come up that descend from a William Hood. They don't have this Mary in their trees, but they have a William Hood with a couple kids in the right time and place to be siblings. So, and that would make sense with the first son being named William. So let's see my DNA track. Oops, where did I go? So here we have this come up, and my brother, my aunt, and I all match him at about this distance, which is about the right relationship. And I see public family tree, and I'm all excited. There's one person. There's literally one person, and it says private. You with me? How many of you are just ready to, at this point, bonk your head on the table, right? Well, I got lucky. So I went to look at his shared matches. And this is the first match that we both have. And it's his uncle, another third cousin or so for me. And not only is it his uncle, his tree says there's a common ancestor for me. So what do I do at this point? I flip to the uncle's page. And this is why it's worth looking at those shared matches, because lo and behold, look who we find. Maria Ann Arthur and Mary Hood as her mother and the shared ancestor. And I go through the pre-entry for her, and says she's born in Ireland. Look where she dies, Massachusetts. And again, going back to this one, so he has a sister, Maria Ann, and a daughter. And the really funny thing is, on one of the censuses, on the 1921 census, she is living about 6 or 7 blocks from where my parents and I lived when my brother was born in Massachusetts. How's that for a coincidence? One of her kids was still living in that same town in Massachusetts when we lived there in the late 1960s. My parents could have run into him and not known it was my dad's third cousin once removed. How's that for a coincidence? Now, I had trouble finding some of this because how's this? I had Frank Graham and Maria and Arthur from the census. Well, it turns out they're in the marriage records as Francis Graham. And this is not a case of Ancestry doing a really bad transcription. Look, Erahus. There's no way that's you're getting Arthur out of that. So the mistranscription was earlier in the process. But notice here, her parents are Edward and Maria. Next year, the death records come out for Massachusetts, and I'm hoping the death record actually has Maria's um, last name to prove it's Hood and not somebody else. But I figure this is a pretty good case. So we're back to this. So we get this match because one of their daughters has a grandson who took a DNA test. This couple has a great grandson take a DNA test. And that ties into the Massachusetts for the American. And as I said, I've also just in the last month gotten 2 new matches dissenting from this William Hood. They must have, and they're like cousins. They must have done it for Christmas or something. So I just wanted to show you that sometimes patience is a virtue. Going back over your matches can be good. And when someone doesn't have a tree, looking to see if there's a close-ish relative, in this case meaning second cousin or closer, who's a shared match who does have a tree. So that, like in this case, the one guy had one person in his tree, did me no good, but his uncle was there with a tree. So now some of you will have seen this one. This is my other really favorite example. So again, we have my great grandparents and following back, Elizabeth Little, William Little, and then William's parents were William Little and Elizabeth Miller. And I'm guessing Margaret and William here were living in northern Scotland. And based on when the kids are born, they moved back to southern Scotland 1849, 1850. And I'm guessing it was because the older William here was either had died or was dying. And so William, as the oldest child, went back to help his mother. Well, his mother is the daughter of a William Miller and Helen Douglas. And yeah, I sometimes tease my brother that he was either going to be Edward or William. There was just no other choice if my dad was naming him. So what's interesting about these two, William and Helen, they get married in 1785 in Hawick, again, southern Scotland. Oops. So, here we're down to just the direct line. And I had this big cluster of relatives. For my aunt, I'm up to 132 in the group. For my brother, there are 37. And then since I just got mine done, and there's some overlap. So, there were some of the names are the same, so I can put them in a big, huge clump. And then my matches, and again, I've coded these all with the one that I know they're descended from this couple. And the ones that have this M, I have found a paper trail to that confirms. Whereas these that just have the one, they match all of the others. So I'm pretty sure they have to be descended from the same couple, but there's a gap in the paper records that I can't connect them. So yeah, here's their marriage record. So you have William Miller and Cavers and Helen Douglas um, gave up their names for proclamation in order to marriage. And here's what we end up with. Um, I'm not sure how many children they had total, but they had 5 children who lived until 1855 or later. And that's the year civil registration starts in Scotland, where they ask for both parents' names, including the mother's maiden name. And so I have death records for these 5 people that all list William Miller and Helen Douglas as their parents. And as you can see here, I have found 33 paper trails, me and 32 others, from 5 children and 10 grandchildren of this couple who are DNA matches for me. Now, these are little matches. They're like 9 centimorgans, 13 centimorgans, but you can get lucky. And have, I found this before I did mine. I did it based on my brother's DNA and my aunt's, but I then have added a couple more out of my results. And again, I don't think this is quite good enough for me to get a journal article out of because, you know, I can't eliminate the possibility that there's some other couple we also all descend from. But in terms of me being comfortable putting this in my database, I'm okay with it. Because I think at this point, the odds that it's a different couple are pretty small. And then finally, that's my grandmother again. Had a picture at the beginning. And yes, that's me with her. um, and I think most of you have my new email address, but that's how you contact me. So let's get out of the PowerPoint and come back on. So any questions at this point? As I said, this is just telling good story. I was trying to just tell a good story. Um, but I'm also, as I said, I've been playing around with how to present information so that you don't get all twisted up in all of the William Littles and Elizabeth Littles and Edward Arthurs, because my ancestors were neither creative nor Ashkenazi with their naming patterns. Yet Ashkenazi Jews don't name after living relatives. And so often you can figure out when a grandfather died because suddenly there are 3 grandsons with his name um, born in a year and a half. Uh, but any questions? All right. I will stop the recording.